Okay, we're rolling. And tell me how you came to Spain.
I was traveling around Europe in 1968. Had been in...
Oh, sorry. This is... Okay, take two.
I'd been in Paris in May of 1960. I came over from the States. It was the first time I'd been to Europe. And just when I got over to London, the whole thing started going on in Paris in May of 1968, where everyone went on strike, and de Gaulle was there, and so I went over to Paris. And then after that, I was just traveling around Europe, and somebody said that Formentera was cheap and beautiful, and really easy to live in, and that for $50, $60 a month, a person could live quite comfortably there. So myself and the woman that I was traveling around with, we went to Barcelona from Italy, where we were at the time, and caught a boat for Formentera. And we spent 3 months there. And then I went back to Formentera in 1971 and 72, and lived there through 72. At that time, Formentera was very medieval. There was electricity along the one main road on the island, but all of the houses, which were off the main road, no one had electricity. Everyone used kerosene lights, kerosene lanterns, and cooked essentially on butano, on wood, and although not a lot of wood on Formentera. And so people would get up when the sun came up and farm or fish, which is what people did there. And then when the sun went down, and they'd eat supper and go to bed, because there was no electricity. There was obviously no television.
No radio, no...
Not much. I guess somebody might have had a transistor radio or a battery radio, but there wasn't much radio, and there wasn't really much entertainment, and the people there were not given to reading. There was a bar in town, and people would come in, would come up to the bar after dinner. Some of the malfortunato men, some of the guys, single guys or widowers, who didn't have anywhere else to go, would come up to the bar, and the foreigners were always at the bar. So there was always a show for free, but there was a drastic separation between foreigners and the pages, the people that lived there. They really looked at us as odd people, and we looked at them much the same, really. When you came into Formentera at the port, when you got off the boat, you had to walk up the dock and go through a little a hut that the Guardia Civil had there. And you'd go through the hut, and they would take your passport, write your name down, and then when you were ready to leave the island, you would go to the comisaria and ask for your passport back, so that they kept close watch on who was there, but they didn't really much interfere with us.
The foreigners there, was that like a tourist contingent, or people?
No, it was a hippie contingent. A lot of people were there who might have been to Kathmandu the month before. People who had, in those days crossed Afghanistan on foot, because you could go through Afghanistan. I mean, in the early 70s, you could still go to Afghanistan or Iran, and you could really go. You were more able to go around the world, not spending much money, not needing to fly, without coming to borders where they were you just couldn't go into a country. There were countries like that, but there were not many of them. So people, it was that sort of stop on sort of a hippie travel circuit in those days, kind of.
And Spain in this period was open borders for foreigners?
Spain was pretty much open borders for foreigners, as long as you kept to yourself. I mean, even we had money compared to the people in Formentera. I mean, that's the other thing, is that if I came to Formentera because I could live well on $50 a month, the average person on Formentera who, married and raising a family, they had much less than that probably to live on. People in Formentera, they didn't have much cash at all. And when I first went to Formentera, there were maybe, up in Namola where I lived, there were maybe a few cars, but not many people had cars. There was a bus that ran up and down the island 2 or 3 times a day, an old bus, run by a private company. And there was just not much money. People grew, in Formentera, you could grow just about all you needed to eat, and to eat quite well, actually. I mean, beans and peas and garlic and onion and peppers and tomatoes, some, and people would raise a pig. They'd have a cow, and they'd grow wheat. Wheat grows well there for bread, and there was a miller in each town who would mill the wheat for bread, and that was about it. And you bought coffee, or you got chicory and cut coffee with it, and so you spent a little cash for coffee. The tobacco they grew in Ibiza, and people would go over and smuggle it by boat, pota, and so people didn't even need to buy tobacco much, and tobacco was cheap in those days anyhow. So people didn't have much cash. They had mostly a barter society, which sounds nice, but on the other hand, that story, I was thinking of talking to Edward, that people I rented from, one day they asked us to come over for lunch, and we'd never been over to their house before. You'd go into the door to ask them something was wrong or this or that, but they said, come on over for lunch, and we went and we had lunch, and all during lunch, just in the next room, somebody was just screaming in pain. I mean, really screaming in pain, not closing down on it at all, just really letting it out. And after a while, the guy said to me, he said, oh, sorry about that. He said, that's my aunt. She got cancer, and we just can't afford the medicine to go over to Ibiza and to buy pain medicine. It's just really expensive. And people, there was no cash, and people were really poor. At a level that somebody from the United States, I couldn't really even conceive of that, of having a relative of mine in the house dying and not being able to at least, ease their pain because I couldn't afford to. I mean, no doubt in the United States at that time, maybe people were in that situation, but I had not been among those people. I wasn't one of them, and it was really shocking to me, and there was no health care to speak of in those Franco days,
From what you'd seen of Europe before arriving in Spain and going to Formentera, how did the rest of Europe, Italy, specifically southern Mediterranean Europe, how did that compare to what you saw in Spain?
I didn't really, I can't say about Italy. I mean, I'm sure that if you were in a back country in Italy, in some way away villages, that it would have been like that. But even say, I traveled quite a bit on the Adriatic coast in Yugoslavia and had spent a lot of time in Paris, and it was not, Spain was not Europe in those days. And they said that, I mean, the saying, was always that Europe stops at the Pyrenees.
Spain is different.
And and it was very closed in. It was every person for themselves. It was really tough. And it wasn't, for a Spaniard, it had been tougher. Say in 1945, it was much harder. Even a healthy person could be so hungry as to get sick and die. And that wasn't likely to happen, I don't think, maybe when I was there in 1970, 71. But still, people were really, really poor. There wasn't much to buy. People were not consumers at all. The only people that traveled were people who went elsewhere looking for work. I mean, in those years, Spaniards in Formentera, they would go to Uruguay to work in the mines, but then Spaniards, a lot of Catalans went to Germany, and a lot of Spaniards went to Germany to work in the factories, and then, but people went away looking for jobs, but there was not any Spanish tourists. And so, I mean, but in those years, maybe for, I don't know why, maybe for money, they would let young tourists go to Formentera or Ibiza, as long as you gave, they identified you and gave out your passport, whereas young Spaniards couldn't go. People from Barcelona, 20-year-olds in those years from Barcelona, who all of a sudden turned up in that little hut with the policia in it, in the port in Formentera, would be likely told to get on the boat and go back to whatever place in Spain that they came from, because otherwise they'd get contaminated. There were those hippies there, and they didn't want like young Spaniards mixing with those young people in in Formentera, Ibiza. I don't know why they let us come at all. I don't know.
I guess the sounds remarkably isolated. You get a feeling of the regime in Madrid. Did that have an existence or a presence in Formentera?
Well, in those years, the regime in Madrid, it did, but not it certainly did for the Formenterans. And the Formenterans would explain that once I got to know people, for instance, the guy that was renting us the house had been a nationalist, had been a Franco supporter for a long time, and he was really, there were people, it's a small island, and like any small island or village or town, after the war, everybody remembered what side their neighbors were on. And everyone remembered who had taken advantage of the situation to settle scores. There were people who, their family members had been killed, ostensibly having to do with the war, but in reality having to do with maybe some quarrel between the families that went back way before, or something like that. And everyone knew what side everyone else had been on, although there weren't a lot, there were some people by that time from Republican families, but no one talks about it at all. I mean, and if you got to know someone really, really well, I remember one person saying to me, that landlord of yours, he was a real mean son of a bitch during the war. He got blood on his hands, but people would never talk. And that was out there. Remember where we were walking outside, but politics was never brought up in the bar.
Franco was still in power.
Yeah, this is when Franco was still in power.
So it was a very oppressed subject. There was no longer any violence. There was no continuation of these family feuds. Or
No, it was all very repressed. I mean, daily life went on, difficult daily life went on. There was no running water either. Much in most places. Most places didn't have running water. Like they had wells. But it was hard. It was a hard life, and it was pretty isolated. And but there was no imminent hostility. I guess most of the left wing, most of the Republicans were probably either dead or in exile somewhere. But there were certainly families left who had fought on the side of Republicans or had not fought on the side of Franco's troops. There was a priest who was a powerful person in the little town. The little town where I was, the one bar that was open at that time was run by a woman who was a widow. I don't know if her husband died in the war or not. And she had a son. He was just a boy in those days. He was maybe 8 or 9 years old. And every day, 3 times a day, the church was right next to the bar, a little plaza in the middle of La Mola, Pilar de La Mola. And every day the priest would come over for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And Catalina would go back in the kitchen and fix the guy's meal. The priest would sit in the corner, have a glass of wine, and eat. And he never paid, of course, because it was sort of And the story goes that, the mother died, and I guess she was still alive when Franco died, but she was in a wheelchair, she had a stroke, and he had taken over the business. When he was only 18 or 19, he stepped up and took over the bar and kept it open. And when Franco died, the next day, the priest came in for breakfast, and this guy said, "You son of a bitch, you're never eating a free meal again here in your life." And so the priest, by that time, a second bar had opened up. So the priest went across the street to the second bar, and she was a devout Catholic. And this guy had become a socialist, really, as the transition, as Franco got sick and his grip loosened.
So you were in Formentera that whole time, this whole transition of going downhill?
No, I wasn't. I was not in Formentera when Franco died. I was in the States. I was in Portland, Oregon. This is a story I heard later when I came back. I came back in the end of 1980, while the transition was still going on, and that was one of the stories.
You returned to Formentera at that point. And what was What was the change? I guess you would have left Formentera in 70.
I left in end of 73 and came back in end of 79, I guess, actually.
Okay.
In 79.
The changes that you saw there, were they dramatic?
They were really dramatic. Yeah, they were. It was a tremendous amount of change. I mean, in a way, because all of a sudden one thing that happened was that anybody who wanted to could go to Formentera. And an awful lot of young people, say from here, who had not been able to go and wondered what the hell was going on down there in Formentera and Ibiza. Ooh, all they hear about was like tourists, people, young people down there getting high, chasing each other around, not wearing any clothes. Everybody wanted to go, and everybody went. And it was, I mean, and here too in the city as well, everything had changed very much. It was one of those moments where it seems like the weight of history is lifted off of you. And that there's, in the fact that the weight of the dictatorship had been taken away here, there was a sense for a few years of people that they were no longer bound by history, and that the mistakes of history were not necessarily going to repeat themselves in their lives, and that any kind of society that people wanted to construct, they were able to do it right here, right now. That was the sense, that was sort of the exuberance that happened when Franco died, and it became clear that it was not going to be a smooth transition to another dictatorship, and that in fact some form or other of resembling democracy was going to happen, and that it wasn't going to carry on as it had been before. People were people were just elated. They were really excited in lots of different ways, lots of different places. It's just that sense. I think that's a very rare sense. I mean, as hippie, you'd have to say that was the defining ethic of hippies, was that we don't have to be slaves to history, and we don't have to carry on as you've always carried on. Probably an erroneous and ingenuous mistake. But one that gives you good sense that when you're making it, it's exciting, and it certainly was going on here. People really felt like that a really better world was just around the corner, and in a sense it was. Mm-hmm. I mean, you're not going to find somebody who's got their aunt dying in the next room without any pain killers at all, and that's worth a lot. It's really worth a whole lot. Now there's 10,000 cars on Formentera, there's traffic jams 3 days a week. Everybody's got 3 television sets. They don't know what to do with the money. There's still, I guess, there's nothing to do. There's got so much money. What do you do with it? You can only travel so much a year. You got to be there in the summertime to do whatever you do for the tourists and the people that own expensive houses there. So, but I mean, you can't say that that's bad, because those times under Franco, they were not good. Not just because people didn't have electricity, but because they didn't have anything, and they didn't have any help about it at all from the government.
So there's been massive material gain, but going back to, for example, you were saying that it was almost like a self-censorship when it came to these stories of troubles between people. Everyone knew who everyone else whose side they were on during the war. How did that come through the Franco period?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know what. I think that because, well, I think in the same way that it did on the rest of the country and here in Barcelona too, there's been nobody came to anybody and said, "Hey man, when you had that gun on, is what you did to me, and now I want mine back." Nobody did that in any way, and there were no trials, there was no judicial or legislative action. And I don't think people did, just as people had managed somehow to carry on their daily lives before Franco died without letting that absolutely, destroy the rhythm of their daily life or tear them up. I think they just carried on. But the shoe was on the other foot, no question about that. And that story really illustrates it, that the priest came in and that Miguel said to him, "No man, not now, those days are gone." And everyone all over was saying, "No, those days are gone." And there was, then you got to put something in their place. What's it going to be?
And this was almost a one day to the next thing.
Well, I don't think so. I think that people probably were very cautious and very worried for a long time. I don't think that necessarily happened overnight. I think probably, when Franco died, I think people were very worried. I mean, there was a large range of things that could have happened. People remembered the last war, and they certainly didn't want that to happen again. But the military was the military, and he'd been with Franco all the time, and it was just I'm sure it was very difficult. I wasn't here, but I know from talking to people, and there was a lot of caution, and a lot of worry, a lot of, what if it gets worse? And I think it unfolded the transition in such a way that it was good. I mean, there wasn't any evening of accounts or calling to account of people, but on the other hand, it worked out okay. Eventually the military changed, they relinquished power, all the old dinosaurs sort of faded away, and something else replaced what was here that was a lot better, for sure.
Were you here in 1981? February?
I was here in 1981 on February 23rd, and I was in Formentera, and I was in the bar. And when Tejero took over the Congress, the only, I think that this, if I remember correctly, the only military brigade that supported him was in Valencia, or it was one of two. And in Valencia, the military went to the radio station, and they took the radio station, Radio Nacional España, and they began to broadcast saying that, that there was a coup, an uprising. There was an uprising, and that the Congress had been taken, and that the military was now in control, and everyone was to go to their homes. Everyone was to leave their work and go home and await further developments. And people in the bar in Formentera, this is a long way away from anything. Police are not even anywhere around. They're down in another town, and there's nobody of authority up there in this bar. Everyone went home, and some people went home crying. People were really scared, and really scared. Men and women were crying, and went to their homes. And I was astounded. I just, it really gave me the sense of, some sense of the fear under which people had lived before that I hadn't probably perceived. I mean, these were not things I knew then, because I was just a 22-year-old in a daze, But seeing how people reacted, it was terrible. And I went home, and we turned on the radio, and we followed it on the radio. And then after the king had intervened and everything, the next day in the bar, they had a TV in the bar at that time, and it wasn't on during the day, it was on at night. But all during the next day, they replayed the scene of the guy going into the Congress and all of the deputies, except for the brave ones, getting down on the floor under their desks when he told them to get down on the floor under their desks, and And from that point on, that was certainly the end of the transition. After that, everyone realized that there wasn't going to be a repeat. But you could tell that day when everyone went home, they all thought, "Damn, I knew this was going to happen. I knew it was too good to last." It was very strong.
So it's something I've never really thought about asking anyone, but it's a good question. There's no sensation. Formentera might not be the best context in which to have witnessed it to answer the question, but there was no feeling like I'd imagine in 1934, 1936, when the government, or when the military tried to take power in the 30s, the people formed. They fought back. The Republic held through years of war. In 1981, there was no preparation for this. It was a complete surprise. Was there no feeling anywhere in Spain that you're aware of that maybe people would have?
I think there was. People probably would have resisted. It would have been armed resistance. But who knows? A tremendous number of the Republicans were killed, and their families were scattered, the survivors. So who knows what if you had an absolutely free election just right then and said, okay, do you want, shall Franco go on or not? Who knows what the results would have been? I mean, there's 40 years here of a dictator, a real dictator, a father figure, somebody who's saves you here and he's going to save you after death too, essentially, and protect you and keep Spain great and grand and glorious and away from all the corrupting influences of the rest of the world, which is clear because there's no crime and it's no commotion, this and that. I mean, a lot of people right after Franco died, of course, were worried. A lot of people were functionaries. Also, I mean, a lot of people's livings were threatened in some way or another, and suddenly the unions were back and strong, real unions. So everybody who belonged to the one Francoist union, I'm sure a lot of them felt threatened. So, I mean, I think people were probably worried that things would descend into armed conflict if they had their way, if Tejero and his group had their way. Who knows what would have happened? But it was certainly...
But apart from this one blip in the process, it was a long series of compromises by both sides, presumably to bring...
It seems to have been.
Together.
Yeah, there's an article in today's País about it, about how, while most people say, well, it was the king and Suarez who held the country together, that in fact it was, who doesn't get credit in historical memory, this article was saying, are the workers, because there were tremendous numbers of strikes during the transition, and the unions were alive again, and the workers really took a hand, and there was a lot of that pressure brought to bear on how things shaped up, easing the country toward a more representative situation where just a few, an oligarchy, wouldn't be able to make decisions, whether they were technocrats or whether they were people from the old government. There was just people really did rise up. People really had been kept down, and they really, as you can tell, living here today, I mean, it's hard to imagine. It's almost impossible to imagine, walking down the street today, seeing two guys, different races, kissing on the street. When before, if you walk down the street, two Spaniards, heterosexuals, engaged officially to be married, and chastely kissed each other on the lips. Jail time. You could go to jail. You could. It was against the law. You weren't likely to go to jail if all those factors were true, but it was against the law. I mean, and it's quite a while. It's 50 years now that was the case, but still, it's not all that long. It's a drastic change. So there was all that energy that's here now, but it was and it was unbelievably, life here was very, very regimented, like public life. It was very, very, very limited, very narrow. And you're talking about people who are not, I don't think, essentially, really put together for that here. I think there's a lot more, I don't know, people are much more, life and demonstrative, and it's curious.
So what brought you from Formentera to Barcelona? If you're in Formentera in the very early 70s.
It was very early 70s and then the very early 80s, and then I went back to the States and worked in the States and as a reporter, and became a journalist, and came back in 91 because the Olympics were going to be in 92, and I thought, well, even a scuffling journalist surely can make a living if they're going to be the Olympics. So I came over to work and met a Spanish woman, stayed essentially. It's a typical story.
Been here ever since.
And been here ever since. I always came through Barcelona because when you went to Formentera, if you had some sort of business or I remember in Formentera in those days, to make a phone call, you had to get the bus, and there was no phone up in the Mola. No one had a phone. Even the bar, there was not a phone in those days. And you had to get the bus early in the morning, go down to the town down below, which was like about 14 kilometers on the bus, go to the one locutorio, as it were, a very primitive locutorio, in town, and they would put the call through and it would take anywhere from 10 minutes to 3 hours. You just never knew how long it's going to take to get the call through. It depended on how the equipment was working or how many other people were on the line, up the line. And I don't know what it depended on. But you could wait, you know, it could be a good 4, 5, 6 hour process. And of course, from the States, it's 6 hours earlier there. So it was all, I mean, doing anything like that was just incredibly time consuming. I mean, just to do anything, mail was amazingly slow. You know, you could send a letter, it would easily take a month to get there. It'd take you, there was a post mistress in La Mola, and you go every day and you'd say, do I have any mail? And some days she'd seem to look carefully through it, and other days she'd just say, no, you don't have any mail. And you'd say, oh, are you sure that looks like a letter with an American stamp on it right there? It looks like it's got my name on it. She'd say, no, you don't have any mail. And that'd be that, you know. You'd have to wait, you'd go back the next day, and maybe you'd have some mail.
What was the language that they spoke in Formentera when you were there?
Mostly, well, we all spoke Spanish. And I mean, I must say that it's not a particularly great thing to have done to have been a hippie in Formentera. I mean, in those years, and it was certainly not, I didn't have much cultural sensitivity. Mostly I hung out with the foreigners who were there at my age, you know. Mostly acting stupid, sometimes I worked with the pajes, you know, we would do jobs sometimes too in exchange for things, or sometimes for rent. I would help the landlord do a job. But mostly we were really apart, so I didn't understand anything about Catalonia or Catalan. The pajes speak a very different kind of a Catalan down there in Formentera, but you never heard it. Pretty much when I was around, people would speak Spanish always to me. I assume they spoke Catalan amongst themselves, but I didn't even remark on it. You know, we were basically fairly insensitive to the culture. One thing that happened in Formentera after Franco died that I know about, but it was really after the transition, after '81, and things, there was a lot of heroin. There was a tremendous amount of heroin among the foreigners that were there in sort of the mid-'80s. And there was a substantial number of AIDS cases that developed in Formentera and Ibiza during those years. There was a lot of people died, and there was a lot of heroin. But it was after I was gone. I didn't really see that. I know it to have been the case. And but I didn't really understand about the Catalan question until I came to Barcelona in the 90s.
And there you discovered it.
I mean, no one that lives here.
92 was pretty full force, wasn't it? From the photographs I've seen, the Catalan flags.
Yeah, 1992 was very full force. Yeah, and the usual discussion about how much it should be a Catalan event versus how much it should be a Spanish event. You know, it's the Olympics. But no one lives here and avoids the Catalan question. You know, so I mean, you have it all the time. It's always in front of you, but there it wasn't.
Were you in Barcelona when Tejeras?
When Tejera went in, I was there in Formentera. When Taradellas. No,
sorry.
No, I wasn't. No, and it never even crossed my radar in the States.
Oh, you were in the States.
I was in the States when that happened. Yeah.
So it's something that completely went by you.
Went by me, yeah. Yeah.
But you've before and after.
Before and after, yeah.
Is there a feeling of a change from being here before he returned to after he returned?
Well, no, but I think it certainly is the feeling of a change from being here before Franco died, and after he died and Taradellas could return. You know, that was just one of many things that could happen. It did happen, for sure.
Okay. Hope we can cut the questions out of this and we're forgetting names.
No, that's great.